This video is sponsored by Movie Palette. Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the pizza-chewing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles get a reboot with Mutant Mayhem. 15 years after Baxter Stockman, voiced by Giancarlo Esposito, dropped his ooze into New York sewers, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, including Mika Abbey's Donatello, Shimon Brown Jr.'s Michelangelo, Nicholas Cantu's Leonardo, and Brady Noon's Raphael, have been raised by their rat father Splinter, voiced by Jackie Chan, who warns them against interacting with humans. After accidentally revealing themselves to aspiring reporter April O'Neil, voiced by Iowa Debris, she alerts them to a series of robberies across the city, and the Turtles discover the mastermind behind them is Superfly, voiced by Ice Cube, who leads a gang of Baxter's former mutants with a plan to destroy humanity. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles have had a very checkered history with the big screen. In 1990, they had their first live-action outing backed by Jim Henson, who gave absolutely terrific suits to the production, as well as the fact the film just got the tone just right, in that it was perfectly suitable for kids, but did have a little bit of a dark edge to it, maybe a little bit too much so for parents at the time who complained about its content and its violence. But several decades on, that still holds up as arguably being the best Turtles movie to date. Sadly, its sequels were a case of rapidly diminishing returns, with the third film effectively killing the franchise on screen for over a decade. In 2007, we got the first CG animated feature, TMNT, which largely felt like a fans-only affair for the most part. Then, in 2014, we had Michael Bay producing a reboot of the Ninja Turtles with god-awful CGI designs. Those character designs in those movies are so ugly. The first film was embroiled in a lot of late-stage reshoots when it's revealed that they were going to turn the Turtles into aliens and basically give them the Transformers treatment, and the sequel, Out of the Shadows, in 2016 was an improvement on that prior movie in that it felt like a very silly Saturday morning cartoon, but nevertheless, the ship had already sailed and audiences didn't return for the follow-up. Which brings us to Mutant Mayhem, which is meant to kick off a whole new version of the franchise, which is going to be spun off into a television series that's going to fill in the gaps for this film's sequel in a few years' time. This version of the Turtles is backed by Seth Rogen, who was apparently a big fan of the property when he was a kid, and it's directed by Jeff Rowe. So if you thought the movie had a lot of Lord and Miller DNA to it, despite the fact they're not actually involved with this movie, that's the reason why. Rowe directed The Mitchells vs. the Machines, which they were involved in, and he carries in a lot of that style and aesthetic into this version of the Turtles. And the question with this remake is whether it can regalvanise the Turtles for an entire new generation. And I would say, yes, it does, even if it's not the perfect Turtles movie. The first most immediately striking thing about Mutant Mayhem is its entire visual look. It's another example of how the Spider-Verse movies have rejuvenated Western animation by allowing filmmakers to be more daring and experimental in their approach, to actually create unique art styles that reflect their movies' distinctive personalities. And this is a great example of that. What Jeff Rowe is doing here basically expands upon what he was doing in Mitchells vs. the Machines. That movie had a very scrappy look about it, leaning into the aesthetic of doodles, you know, the kind of crude drawings that you'd make in the edges of your notepad. And Mutant Mayhem takes that and goes one step further, and so there is a purposefully kind of rough look to the entire movie, and you might even call it ugly, but it's a deliberate kind of ugliness because obviously we're dealing with mutant reptiles, so that makes sense. Not only do you have that kind of hand-drawn aesthetic on top of 3D, but also the character designs are very unusual in that they're quite asymmetrical and odd looking. Even the human characters have a kind of vaguely monstrous quality to them. The look of the movie has this very youthful, kinetic look about it, especially in the action set pieces, where they really go into the almost abstract. Even when the movie isn't entirely capturing your attention, it always looks brilliant. There are a couple of little issues with the animation. Sometimes the lighting makes characters look a little bit too three-dimensional, which looks very odd with this art style, and I can understand just not liking the aesthetic of it in general, or finding it too busy, because there's a lot happening on screen constantly, but clearly you can tell that they wanted to make this the Spider-Verse of the Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. You can tell that by the look of it, and you can tell by the story. What sets this version of the Turtles apart from virtually every other incarnation I can think of is it leans very heavily on the teenage part of the title. So while it is a retelling of their origin story for a new, younger audience, it also reframes it as a coming-of-age tale. There's an early scene where the Turtles are sneaking around the city and they catch an open-air screening of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is a little bit weird because it's live-action clips in the middle of this animated film, and I personally would have animated them to fit more with the aesthetic of the movie, but that's a small gripe. The point is, it sets up this idea that this is almost like the 80s John Hughes version of the Turtles. That's their homage and their debt, but it also sets up that the Turtles are yearning for a proper teenage life. They've been taught all their lives to be afraid of the outside world, that it's openly hostile and threatening to them, that they won't be accepted, but they're at an age where they're now starting to push at their boundaries. They're kind of getting into trouble, but also there is this desire to actually be accepted and be embraced for who they are. And so in that sense, they kind of find it with the other mutants when they encounter them later in the movie. That offers potentially that environment for them to actually be with people that are like them, but they also want to be involved with the human world and are so endlessly fascinated about it. It again kind of roots their fixation with pop culture on this desire of kind of watching the world from a distance. You particularly see this with Leonardo, who more than anything else desperately wants a quote-unquote normal teenage life. And I think this reflects the target audience, and there's a lot of adolescent fears and anxieties about being different and not fitting in and being ostracized for that. The Turtles fear that they are seen as monsters, and more than anything else, they just want to go to high school like everybody else. They want to feel included. And so the whole story of the film is the Turtles, if you excuse the pun, learning to come out of their shells and actually embrace their uniqueness and actually be celebrated for that. And I think that's reassuring for younger viewers. And that youthfulness extends to the voice acting, because again, setting itself apart from other TMNT properties, the Turtles are actually voiced by actual teens for, I think, the first time. The filmmakers very much embrace an improvisational approach, as you would expect for something backed by Seth Rogen. They had all the Turtles actors actually recording together at the same time, and you can hear the difference. The way the Turtles talk feels organic. It feels very much in the spirit of how teenagers actually speak to one another, the way that they bounce off of their conversations. And yeah, sometimes the Turtles are kind of annoying and they talk over each other, but that's what actual teenagers do. But also there is the fact that there is a lot of contemporary references, which makes sense for the Turtles. They've always had that. The thing is, it's a little bit jarring for maybe someone of my age, or someone that has come from the Turtles from much further back, who puts them in the era of, say, Vanilla Ice, which does get a very quick shout out in this movie, but they largely drop references to things like Adele or K-pop, which might be a little bit jarring to those viewers. But the thing is, Mutant Mayhem really isn't trying to cultivate itself towards older nostalgic viewers deliberately, in that yes, it does include little shout outs for those fans, but really it is aiming itself at the younger demographic, which honestly is refreshing to see, because so many of these legacy franchises now are relying solely on references to older versions of it, and instead Mutant Mayhem decides, actually, we're going in a completely different direction that's at once familiar but also brand new in many ways. Jackie Chan is also a great choice as the voice of Splinter, especially because he adds a kind of knowing humour to the role, especially in a key expository flashback early on where he relays his and the Turtles' backstory, with a kind of wink at the fact that, yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it, but just go with it. And he's training the Turtles, of course updated because he's watching tutorials on YouTube, as well as vintage Jackie Chan clips circa Drunken Master, which is a very, very cute touch. And I do think that some longer term fans might be divided about the fact that this version of the character largely drops the backstory that Splinter has had in other versions. Mutant Mayhem is definitely leaning heavier on the fact that Splinter is meant to be the parent, and so over the course of the film he's trying to appease them, he's trying to keep them happy, and he's trying to offer them touches of the outside world to try and get them to stay underground. But the thing is, he's a parent that doesn't quite know how to handle the situation, but also there's this idea that because he was a street rat in Mutant Mayhem, and because he's grown up trying to evade humans, that kind of prejudice and hostility against humanity is what drives much of his decisions about keeping the Turtles underground. And I think there is a good story idea here about Splinter having to confront that, about having to actually deal with his own prejudices, whilst also appreciating that he wants the best for his own children. I think the execution of it in this movie is a little bit too rushed. I do think that the emotional payoff doesn't quite land in the way that it should do, but certainly that's a really strong story idea and gives Splinter a lot more to do than he has done in a lot of other Turtles films. As you've probably already noticed, I've been hinting at, while I think the movie looks visually brilliant, I don't think the script is up to that same level. It's just not as solid as the Spider-Verse movies, which is a bit of a mean thing to say, because honestly those movies are masterpieces. That's such a high bar to reach, but that's clearly what Mutant Mayhem is trying to emulate. That's the point of comparison. So unfortunately, it's the difference between something that's great and something that's just good, and Mutant Mayhem is firmly the latter. And there are some things with the script that I wasn't a big fan of, like, for example, the way it treats April O'Neil. Now, there's nothing wrong with Ira Debris' voice performance. I actually think that she works really well in the role, especially with the teens cast as the Turtles. The problem is that they've given April this absolutely bizarre subplot where she is so terrified of being on camera that she uncontrollably projectile vomits, to the point where this became a viral sensation, and now everyone at high school goes around calling her Puke Girl. And this scene with a huge en masse vomiting sequence just feels like it's wanted out of a completely different movie. Two of the credited writers on the screenplay are of course Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg. This seems like something that they wrote, and it feels like something that's wanted out of one of their R-rated comedies and has landed in this family movie, and it just kind of feels a bit out of place and a bit unnecessary. But the biggest issue that I had with the script is that in terms of its story structure and pacing, it's very odd. The first half of the movie, for example, is strangely lacking in mayhem or mutants aside from the Turtles and Splinter. And I understand why, because in many ways the film is designed to set up this whole new incarnation of the franchise, and so it needs to set up all the pieces. So a lot of time is spent in the first half of the movie actually setting up the Turtles' relationship and the Turtles' relationship with April and with Splinter and all that stuff. That's all necessary. The problem is that it feels actually slow on a story progression level, in that not much is actually happening in terms of the narrative. It's only around halfway through, when the Turtles finally meet Superfly and the rest of the mutants, that it finally finds its own momentum. But until that point, I do have to admit that I was starting to to drift away from the movie, and I was doing that as an older adult viewer. You can imagine the kids in the rest of my screening, who I do have to admit were starting to get a little bit fidgety and restless in the middle portion of this movie. It simply wasn't holding their attention in the way that it should do, but it does recover from that once it finally kicks into gear the plot of the film. Ice Cube is well cast as Superfly. He has the right kind of menace and intensity that he calls upon, but also he's very well versed in improvisational comedy, going back all the way to the Jump Street movies. And the way that they've characterized Superfly is very well done, especially in the way that they've kind of made him a mirror image of Splinter in some respects, in that because he grew up as a fly, he has a lot of resentment for humans, to the point that he has become toxic, if you excuse the pun, and he just simply wants to overthrow the rest of humanity and replace them with mutants as the dominant species. He's not interested in integrating himself into society. He wants to destroy it no matter what the cost. The movie also reintroduces a number of members of the Turtles Rogue Gallery, many of which haven't actually appeared in a film version before. For example, Bebop and Rocksteady are voiced by Seth Rogen and John Cena. And I do have to admit the movie commits a little bit of an own goal here by casting Rogen as Bebop, which traditionally in a number of previous Turtles adaptations was actually voiced by a black actor and was a black character that had mutated, although this film actually kind of sidesteps that in that Bebop and Rocksteady are just mutated animals in this incarnation, but still kind of worth noting. But nevertheless, Rogen and Cena do work off of each other quite well, but I think most of the movie is stolen by Paul Rudd as Mondo Gecko, who is absolutely hilarious. Rudd is just having a ball of a time, just kind of leaning into this overtop surfer shtick. Bro. He even gets a introducing Paul Rudd credit at the very end of the movie, which is quite amusing. I think that Rudd is actually funnier in his few minutes of screen time in this film than he was in pretty much the entirety of Quantumania. And I do think that the casting choices they put into these villain roles is pretty good. You got Post Malone as Ray Fillet, constantly singing. That's why they've cast Post Malone. But also Rose Byrne as Leatherhead. My issue is that the movie tries to cram too many villains in, and I know what the filmmakers were doing here. They're trying to establish these characters so that they'd be set up for the television series, where they'll get their own individual episodes and get expanded upon there. The problem is, in such limited screen time, there really isn't that much room to actually make these characters fully formed, and especially make them distinctive, and so they just kind of blur into each other, especially if you're not familiar with them from previous Turtles incarnations. It kind of feels like a little bit of a waste of the starry voice cast to just basically make them extended cameos, maybe having about 5 or 10 lines if they're lucky overall. It just feels like a little bit too much, especially when they don't actually do all that much in the movie. There's only one major set piece where they're all fighting against the Turtles in this kind of extended car chase, which is exciting and well done, but with all these villains, you'd expect the Turtles to have more confrontations with them over the course of the story, when really that's not how it plays out. But as if the movie doesn't have enough issues with pacing or villains, it then throws TCRI into the mix, which is a big part of the Turtles lore, because they created the ooze that everyone's come from. And the movie establishes them in the prologue with a hunting down Baxter. That's how it ended up in the sewers, and I personally would have actually left it there. I would have actually come back to it at the very end of the movie, maybe as a mid-credits scene, just to re-establish them for the television series and not have it intrude too much on the main plot of the movie. But that's exactly what ends up happening here, in that the movie seems to be building up momentum towards the climax, and then it just stops for about 10 minutes for all this TCRI stuff that I personally feel is completely unnecessary. The story could have done without it. TCRI are led by Cynthia Utrom, voiced by Maya Rudolph, with a very peculiar and, to Turtles fans, maybe quite telling accent. She wants to create super soldiers using the mutants, so she spends the whole movie watching them and waiting for a moment. And yeah, this sequence does have the payoff to a very weird milking gag that runs all throughout the movie. Again, I'm gonna wager that's a Rogen and Goldberg edition, but even so, I don't think that necessitates this entire stretch of the movie, which is largely unnecessary. It just slows down and bloats out the movie and adds yet another villain to a story that simply doesn't need it, and as a result, it feels like something that would have been better served with just focusing on it in the television series rather than as a distraction in the film itself. It's another example of the movie trying to cram far too much into its shell. But once all that stuff is out of the way, the movie finally delivers on the mutant mayhem it's been promising, and the action set pieces in this art style are really visually arresting and dynamic, and they're aided even further by the soundtrack by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, which provides a pounding backbone to many of them. In fact, my issue is I don't think the film actually made full use of their scoring, because a lot of the movie has licensed music over it, which is a big issue in family films of late. It feels like they're just playing the hit because kids like them and they provide a bit of nostalgic flavour for adults, and it feels like those songs are taking the place of where scoring should actually be. But still, when it finally arrives, the mutant mayhem does actually deliver, especially because in animation they're allowed to get some properly big scope out of those set pieces and go full kaiju at the end of the movie in a way that we haven't really seen in other Turtles properties. I just wish overall the movie had a bit of a better balance where it found time for its characters that it clearly loves and having those action beats to go alongside them. And I feel like the movie is almost there, but not quite right in terms of balancing that on its swords. You can tell that Mutant Mayhem is made by people that clearly adore the Ninja Turtles, and that passion can be felt at all times, even if it's maybe a little bit too much to cram into 99 minutes. I don't think it's the best Turtles movie today. I still think that's held by the 1990 film, and I'm not saying that out of nostalgia. You see, I was born a little bit too late for the Turtles' initial popularity, so by the time I was growing up, they were very much out of fashion. I didn't see any of the Turtles films until I was an adult. I didn't see them until 2016, so I'm telling you, genuinely, I do think the Henson 1990 film is the best one, but Mutant Mayhem is very much a close second. The thing is, though, I'm an old. This movie really isn't made for me. It's made for younger viewers. It's there to establish the Turtles for a whole new generation, and I think the movie succeeds at that, and the way that it ends up, it leads to something that I think shows a very different direction for the Turtles to head in that actually shows a lot of promise and potential for new storylines. I think that there is a lot of life for the heroes in a half shell yet. You've probably seen this swish thing in the background of the entire video. This is a movie palette. It takes the colour tone of an entire movie and turns it into this artwork. So each of these lines represents a scene or sequences from the entire movie. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you would like a movie palette of your own, then you can go to moviepalette.com and use the code FilmBrain15 to get 15% off your order. And thanks again to Movie Palette for sponsoring this video. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy some of my merch for my TeePublic page, or you can shell out for my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply like, share and subscribe. Those all help as well. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.